Hello, everybody. My name is Dimitris Papadimitriou. I am the director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence here in Manchester. Before we kick off with the seminar, let me just say a few words about the centre in case some of you are joining us for the first time. The Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence here brings together the research and teaching expertise of 3 universities across Greater Manchester: the University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, and the University of Chester. It brings together a very large student community of nearly 100,000 students. Very big departments of political science, social sciences, and a significant expertise on all matters European, both focusing on the European Union, but also on Europe as a whole. The center is organizing a very rich program of events throughout the year. So I would ask you to follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, visit our website where you will be able to find updates on our regular seminar series that runs every 2 weeks on a Wednesday, but also information about special events and our annual lectures that take place in March, April every year. So stay tuned. Would like to hear from you. Would like you to join the conversation. You know, don't feel that the Brexit has ended all interest in Europe in this country. That's not true. There are many of us who continue to be very keen observers of all things European. And with that in mind, let me just introduce today's speaker. It gives me great pleasure to welcome him virtually to Manchester. Dr. Chris Featherstone is a teaching fellow at the London School of Economics, where he teaches, among other things, international and European politics. He has also recently completed an excellent a PhD at the University of Birmingham, focusing in particular on British and American foreign policy making on the war in Iraq, the reasons and the decision making that led to the war in Iraq, and also to some extent the decisions surrounding British and American involvement or non-involvement in Syria. He has written subsequently a number of very interesting articles. He is by all means a very good expert on British foreign policy, and there are not that many around, I have to say, but also American foreign policy. And today's seminar in many ways brings this expertise together to help us all make sense of the recent agreement, partnership that has been announced between the US, the UK, and Australia, with the provision of expertise to Australia to acquire nuclear submarines. That caught many people by surprise in Europe, many people by surprise around the world. What does it mean for the US? What does it mean for Britain? What does it mean for Europe, of course, right? So to try and tackle some of these difficult questions, I'm delighted to introduce Chris to today's seminar. He has agreed to speak to us for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and then that will give us plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Just let me remind you that for those of you who wish to ask questions, and please do, we are always very, very keen to hear from the audience. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. My colleague and the Deputy Director of the Centre, Dr. Catherine Simpson, who you can also see on the screen, will collate these questions and direct them to Chris. So Thanks again for coming, Chris. Thanks to everybody for attending. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and very nice that I can speak to you about this madly confusing thing that is AUKUS and the diplomatic fallout of this. So I'll share my screen here. Here we go. So yes, hello. I've obviously been invited here to talk about the security challenges facing the EU, particularly in the light of AUKUS. So when Demetrius sent me the invite, I thought about it and titled my talk, Crisis of Influence, European Security and AUKUS. So the recent AUKUS deal has thrown renewed attention onto this debate, and as such, I'll be making quite a lot of reference to that to start with. So my research, as Dimitris very nicely put it, predominantly focuses on UK and US foreign policy and foreign policy analysis, which is a field that really particularly emphasizes scrutiny of decision-making in foreign policy. So my focus very much is on the interactions between the leaders, the interactions between the group dynamics, and how leaders frame their decisions. So my previous work has been on the invasion of Iraq, but I've also published a couple of articles on the Trump administration's foreign policy. I'm sure you'll all appreciate that Biden is a refreshing change after Trump, so I'm looking forward to having a look at him as well. So I'll start by looking at the context of AUKUS. So what actually is AUKUS? Firstly, it's a new defensive alliance between Australia, the UK and the United States. Initially, they will cooperate to build nuclear-powered submarines. Beyond that, they agree that they will cooperate further in the Pacific. So this deal has caused offence to both France and China. The French were going to build Australia a submarine fleet, but without warning, they heard the announcement of AUKUS. I think they had, some reports have them being warned 3 to 4 hours prior to the announcement of AUKUS. So not only was their deal for the submarines off, but they had also been excluded from this alliance. And the French ambassador has been withdrawn from the US. So it's important to contextualize this falling out between France and Australia, firstly. So France has described this Australian contract as the deal of the century and the start of a 50-year marriage. And they had intended that this deal with Australia would symbolize a wider Australian and French alliance in the Indo-Pacific, but that this would also be the basis for the French Indo-Pacific strategy. And it was, in 2018, the entire basis of their Indo-Pacific strategy. If you look at the media coverage, there's been quite an interesting debate over who has offended the French most with the AUKUS deal. And this is quite a misleading debate, really. I think it's important to remember that there are multiple dimensions to this offence that has been caused. Whilst there is the financial loss for France from this deal, there is also the perception that AUKUS signalled that the signatories did not consider the French in making their deal. And this has been a key part of the offence. France regards itself as a serious actor in international politics, on a par with French and Australia, sorry, not with the French and Australia, with Australians and the UK, and therefore being expected to be consulted and included in this kind of deal. Understandably, China was offended, as AUKUS was widely perceived to be in response to China's aggression in the South China Sea and Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. Relations were already very, very poor before this. A Chinese government spokesman accused Biden of having an outdated Cold War era attitude. Chinese state-owned Global Times went quite a bit further, which is typical when we're looking at Chinese foreign policy. And they declared that Australian troops are also most likely to be the first batch of Western soldiers to waste their lives in the South China Sea, really escalating the rhetoric. For the US, we can interpret wars the Pacific. It also signals that despite Brexit and the tensions with between the Biden administration and the UK government over Northern Ireland, the US still prefers the UK as a partner than the EU. From the UK, AUKUS can be seen as an indication of how the global Britain catchphrase can be turned into a foreign policy strategy. It should also be seen as accompanying the UK government trade policy. For Australia, this can be understood as a solidifying of their alliance in response to increased tension between China and Australia. However, it's also really important that we remember that AUKUS, here we go, apologies about this, is a shared gift of offence. However, it is also a gift that keeps on giving. This deal is by no means finished, and who will make the different parts of these new submarines is yet to be dealt with, really, meaning that there is potential for further tension and for extending the hand of friendship. It's possible that we can see the AUKUS signatories, Australia, the UK, and the US, as reaching back out to France and hoping to lessen this offence. AUKUS is not a fait accompli. That's what I'm trying to say here. There is the potential for this. So Brexit has also implications here, or rather AUKUS, I would argue, has implications for Brexit. It has led to an increased tension between the UK and France, the tensions over refugees crossing the Channel, and the announcement today of increased tensions between the UK and France over fishing rights are both examples of how this poor relationship is continuing to manifest. So the UK government might be pursuing this kind of global Britain strategy. However, they also seem to be doing a very good job of souring relations with other close neighbours and allies. So there is also the potential for further tensions between the US and the UK and Australia in terms of who is going to design and build different elements of this. Australian opposition to AUKUS has also focused on how this deal ties the Australians into the US, as the nuclear components will very likely need to be serviced by the US. This also means that there are more opportunities for diplomatic disagreements between Australia and the US specifically. Biden may represent a return to normality for relations with the US. However, Trump and Trumpian approaches to foreign policy and deals are by no means gone. As I argued in an article I wrote with Asaf Sinova, Trump's attitude towards much of foreign policy is transactional. And as we demonstrated, this really manifested in Trump's relations with NATO. So moving forward, I identify three key security challenges facing the EU at the moment. Each of these, an influence crisis, leadership questions, and Russia, are very current, but all look to be challenges that will endure for a significant period. And the AUKUS case has thrown these security challenges into a new light. So the influence crisis. The first security challenge that faces the EU is this crisis of influence. Essentially, the EU must reevaluate its influence. Given the security issues that the EU must confront, the ability to cooperate with allies will continue to be crucial. Influence will be key. There are several factors that have come together to raise questions over the EU's ability to exercise influence. Firstly, Brexit and the accompanying chaotic negotiations that have resulted has started to give the impression that the EU is distracted internally. Added to this, the internal disagreements within the EU as a 27 has also given the impression that the EU has its own problems to deal with. In particular, the rise of right-wing politics in several member nations, the right-wing government policies from members of the EU, look at the Polish government's judicial reforms, Viktor Orban in Hungary. This has all caused this perception of a distracted EU, or an internally distracted EU, I should say. And also, as I've said, Trump may have been atypical. However, the US really does continue to turn its attention away from Europe. Biden might represent a refreshing, normal turn in the US presidency, but as Patrick Porter, a colleague of mine from the University of Birmingham, has stated, if we accept Afghanistan, Biden's foreign policy is realpolitik wine in a liberal humanist bottle. Whilst Biden is practiced in using this internationalist speak, his administration will pursue quite a blunt statecraft, we can assume. This will mean that the EU must reevaluate how they relate to the US. In coming years, the US will not be drawn into issues where the EU wishes to have US cooperation in the same way as, let's say, the Obama administration were willing to be drawn. AUKUS was also pretty unfortunately timed for the EU, as it coincided very, very closely with the EU's announcement of their own Indo-Pacific strategy, which typically for the EU was exhaustive. This strategy will reportedly be characterized by this cooperation, not confrontation attitude. Given the US's perception of the EU's ambivalence towards China, it's important to follow this strategy up with further clarity. The EU has to either do this in public, or more likely they could do this, make these kind of signals in private to their US counterparts and US allies. I also say perceived ambivalence in the EU attitude towards China, as UK government policy towards China has been rather difficult to follow over the past 10 years, and US policy towards China has been incredibly disjointed over the last 4 years. In the context of AUKUS, the EU strategy will be to provide the cooperative alternative to AUKUS's confrontation. This is a real opportunity for the EU to pursue in their relations in the Indo-Pacific. Secondly, we also have the EU leadership question. So I can already hear some of the Europeanists in the room chomping at the bit and getting ready to comment on this one. So when I was learning about EU politics about 10 years ago now, we discussed this age-old complexity of understanding who takes the lead in the EU. So I do understand that what I'm saying here is perhaps not new, but I would say that these questions over who leads the EU and how are particularly current. However, it's important to say that it's really important to look at what we've got. Look at the stage as it is currently set. So Merkel having exited the stage, the German role in EU leadership is now more debated than it has been in at least the last 14, 15 years. Similarly, Macron is manoeuvring, and so that he and France can take much more of a leadership position. However, given the diplomatic fallout from AUKUS, this is even more complicated than it already or otherwise would have been. The lack of prior warning of the change from the Australian, UK and US governments caused significant bad feeling in Paris. As Georgina Wright of the Institut Montaigne has asserted, the subsequent disregard to the bad feeling that the Biden administration has shown has worsened these relations. The withdrawal of the French ambassador may be quite a dramatic signal, but it is a signal nonetheless that these poor relations do need to be addressed. The Biden administration has signaled that they are going to take this seriously. Secretary Blinken has Monday, Secretary Blinken has visited Paris to discuss with Macron, but much more is necessary. So these questions of leadership are, of course, closely linked to this influence crisis and to how the EU can address this influence crisis. The questions over where leadership in the EU will be found mean that the internal pressures within the EU, both negotiating Brexit, the right-wing challenges to EU norms, and the ongoing migrant crisis are all exacerbated by a lack of a focused EU response. With a widely agreed upon leader, Merkel into the 2008 financial crisis, both of those looking to address the problems within the EU and those causing the issues. Let's the UK, for example, Orban for another, would know where to look for these signals and for guidance on how to proceed. Similarly, by establishing this point of focus, the EU will then be able to reset their relations with the US, and this is crucial to proceed. Finally, Russia. Again, I should say, the Eastern European EU members still need to be reassured of support in regards to Russian aggression alongside NATO efforts. However, at the same time, Russia cannot be pushed too far away. given the gas crisis and the new Nord Stream pipeline, which is yet to be turned on. The cyber threat that Russia presents to all members of the EU is another key security challenge. A key part of this challenge is that it is twofold. Firstly, there are the state cyber attacks conducted or sponsored by the Russian state. I remember a few years ago now, but I spoke to a NATO official and he was telling me that Russian cyber attacks on NATO and EU national governments were occurring multiple times an hour, and it has only increased since then. So then there is the second part of this cyber threat. And this is the state-permitted cybercrime that is accepted by the Russian state, provided it is directed externally. Cybercriminals know that they can commit their crimes in Russia, provided their crimes are outside of Russia. The gas pipeline and the supply, along with the potential for energy hostage-taking, adds another difficulty to this. The need to negotiate such supplies whilst also demonstrating a robust confrontation with Russia to signal unity to Eastern European EU members is another reason why leadership and a clear focal point is crucial. The increased deployment of Russian mercenaries in the Middle East also means that Russian capabilities have had to be reevaluated in recent years, whilst EU efforts to increase the ability of member nations to deploy together militarily have utterly horrified UK papers such as the Daily Mail or the Daily Express with the very idea of an EU army. These efforts do need to continue and be reinvigorated. Opportunities to confront these challenges come in three key areas, I would argue. Firstly, the EU has to determine its priorities. Really, do they want to get more heavily involved in foreign policy, and especially the international politics of the Pacific? Does the EU want to coordinate with the US, or would they rather take this good cop role to the US bad cop, as they did in relations with Iran? It worked quite effectively. And secondly, and relatedly, the EU has to deal with this lack of impact in Washington. As I've said, Biden talks the talk of a liberal humanist, but underneath he remains a realist. As such, the EU will need to demonstrate the gains for Biden if he decides to cooperate with the EU. The reasons for this lack of impact can be boiled down to this disunity, this lack of investment in security, and this perception of an ambivalent attitude to China. And I would argue that cyber presents the most interesting opportunity to the EU with the lowest costs. By investing in cyber capabilities, the EU is not challenging its non-military credentials. However, it also provides the opportunity to invest in security, which helps with this Washington impact, as I said, and can be presented to allies as a defensive action and therefore less problematic in terms of selling it publicly than when compared to other security investments. There would be the opportunity to work on relations between the EU and NATO. In particular, it will also develop links between national governments, Interpol, Europol, and the EU. It also provides the opportunity to work together to confront Russia's aggressive moves, which also signals to EU members and allies of EU commitment to confronting Russia. Similarly, given China's investment in cyber capabilities, this would also provide an opportunity for the EU to signal its confrontational capability to China to accompany this cooperative approach. So I know I've come in a little bit under my time here. I do apologize if I've shortchanged you, but please fire away with the questions and let's get a good discussion going.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for a really excellent overview of some of the key issues involved in all of this. If you can perhaps exit your share screen, and then
will do, of course.
We can all.
There we go.
Yeah, that's great. Again, thank you very much for covering such a broad ground so quickly and so expertly, I may say. It's great. Just before I bring in Catherine in the discussion and encourage once again the audience to submit questions, let me perhaps fire a couple of mine as a starter. And I am more interested here in your expertise on British foreign policy thinking. And I can see very clearly the symbolic value of the gesture behind AUKUS for the United Kingdom. That's pretty clear, I think. But I also wonder, what would you say are the key interests of the UK in that part of the world? Because of course, engagement in this area won't come cheap. I don't think that the UK can have its cake and eat it all because there are other powerful actors there. So what would you say are the key strategic interest of the UK in the Pacific? And secondly, if I may, something that is a bit more focused on Europe. I mean, you did mention the annoyance, the frustration shared in Paris about this deal. And you've also, I think, very well talked about the EU's kind of embarrassment, perhaps lack of initiative on foreign policy. The question, I guess, here is that can the EU replace the loss of Britain from the club in foreign policy terms? And would you say that Berlin will step in to fill that gap?
Well, I think taking the first question, I think it's an interesting question to look at, because we really do have to have a look at how the UK is positioning itself in this region. And it is a complicated field to be walking into. So as much as the EU has been perceived as having an ambivalent attitude towards China, the UK should really be perceived in the same kind of way in Washington. They aren't necessarily, but I believe that they should be seen as not much different, not very different from the EU in their attitudes towards China. UK government rhetoric may be stepped up, but it's passing comment, it's intermittent, and it is not consistent. So I think it is an indication from the UK government to Washington partners that actually we are engaging in this. The UK is interested, and the UK will be the partner that the US wishes to have, or one of the many partners that the US wishes to have in the Pacific. And I think it should also be seen as this focus on the term is overused, but this special relationship. I think that there is an acknowledgement from the UK government, especially the foreign policy area, that this special relationship is perhaps not as special as the UK side has traditionally seen it, but actually that this is something that needs to be worked upon, number one, because there has been a rocky relationship between US and UK leadership over the last, I'd say arguably 10 years, with the disunity and the lack of personal engagement between Obama and Cameron, which has been quite remarked on. And then the infamous relations between Theresa May and Trump, which, we can't really, of all the things we blame Theresa May for, we can't necessarily blame Theresa May for those. And I think it's important to see this as also accompanying trade policy, that this kind of approach towards improving relations, both with the US and Australia, is an important part of trade policy. Linking up and becoming closer is a crucial part of developing, because Boris Johnson has made it very clear that he is very much pursuing a US trade deal and further trade deals with Australia. And this is something that we can see them stepping into. I think if we, sorry, Dimitris, do you mind reminding me of your second question?
Yeah, the second question was whether Germany is likely to step up to fill the gap left by Britain in the EU's foreign policy environment.
Well, I think it's going to be important that the EU reevaluates how they pursue foreign policy. The UK did contribute a certain level of expertise and a certain level of voice and clout on foreign policy matters. But one thing that I have found is actually quite overlooked is the UK's contribution to sanction policy, and actually how much expertise the UK can bring in that area, that this expertise in the formulation of sanctions is something that is useful. And so actually maybe the EU needs to reevaluate how it approaches certain matters, but also the UK I've just been teaching on my Brexit course, this awkward partner label. So the UK was always a little bit annoying, frankly, in terms of EU politics and EU relationships externally. So having that awkward, annoying partner who keeps chipping in and disagreeing or splitting the message, shall we say, if we're talking in a PR kind of way, actually that lack of that annoying voice might be quite useful for the EU. They can speak with a more holistic and more unified voice, and that means that they have an opportunity to take the kind of position that they wanted to take. EU policy, there's a lot of research out there on where the EU sees itself and where the EU is positioning itself. This kind of middle ground between the two superpowers, this bipolar relationship between China and the US, the EU is looking to take this kind of middle ground, and this cooperative, cooperation, not confrontation strategy, we can see it as pursuing that further. So I think it's important that Germany, if someone is going to take that position, it needs to be someone soon. And I think it would be quite a change if Germany were not to be a leading, the leading voice in the EU. However, Macron is continuing to pursue more leadership credentials. So I think Germany will continue to take this kind of leadership role, this leadership voice, but I would also say it's not in the same way as it has been in the past. We are not going to see Merkel come again. But what we could see is German leadership with a stronger and more vocal French contribution. Although French contribution has been vocal in the past, I think it's going to step up even further. And that could present an interesting opportunity.
That's great. Thanks very much. Catherine?
Thank you. I've just got two questions before I open to the questions on the floor. My first question is, do you think the EU sees AUKUS as a crisis, number one? And the second one is, do you think the EU could play a strategic role in the Indo-Pacific region? And a bit of a follow-up from that is AUKUS in general, is it a military and in kind of industrial cooperation between all three nations, or is this kind of a diplomatic revolution? So they're my kind of first three questions before I come to the floor.
Okie doke. Well, I'd say I think that the EU has been very much offended by AUKUS, and I think that cannot be overstated. But at the same time, the old phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. This is a perfect opportunity in which clearly the EU, and more specifically France, are the wronged party here. So this is this kind of opportunity to say, no, we need you to come and try and fix these relations with us. So, come on, fix these relations with us. It's quite a useful opportunity. So, and we can also already see it working. Secretary Blinken has already made a trip to Paris, and I'm sure there is much more going on behind the scenes. So that's an interesting component. I think that the EU has known for a while that US attention is turning away from Europe, and that actually Biden is probably not a European-focused president. So it's something that shouldn't have been too much of a surprise, but I think the extent and the speed was quite a shock. So I think a crisis, but a crisis that they perhaps didn't foresee, but could have predicted something of the kind. In terms of the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific, I think we can see the EU taking an interesting role there. I think that it has the opportunity to take this kind of cooperative role and be the velvet-handed glove compared to the AUKUS confrontational glove. Let's say that the boxing glove compared to the nice soft glove for the handshakes, really. So I think it's important to see that we need to know what's happening, and actually we're still very much in the early days. So how the EU can take this role is up for question, but I think there's definitely an opportunity here. I think this kind of cooperative approach accompanying the US, either explicitly accompanying the US or implicitly reading the situation, reading the relationship between the US and China, and taking that approach, this cooperative approach on their own, the EU can do either. So I think it's an exciting time to be studying this. It's an interesting opportunity. I think AUKUS and how we should understand AUKUS. So the AUKUS signatories, I would argue, see this as far more than simply a military relationship. However, I think it's also important to see that actually there's really a hell of a lot left to do with AUKUS. AUKUS is very much a kind of shell or a container within which many more agreements and contracts and a huge amount of bureaucracy needs to be put. And we haven't seen that yet. So I think it's as I mentioned in the presentation, there's also an opportunity for more disagreement and more spat, more diplomatic spats with the three signatories. So I think they all want it to be more, but I think the minimum it will be is this kind of military development. And also that shouldn't be underestimated. There are certain US and UK military officials and former military officials who've described AUKUS as a opportunity that hasn't come along in probably the last 60 years. So this opportunity to develop this technology in this way is being seen as a very exciting opportunity. In some areas, I would also say that there are significant voices in Australia who are opposed to this and do not like the idea of being drawn into this nuclear technological field and nuclear warfare. So it's all up for grabs, let's say.
Super, thanks, Chris. I'm going to turn it over now to some of the questions we've got coming in. I've got two questions here from Zachariah. And they're asking, the first question is, what ramifications will AUKUS have on the South China issue and Taiwan? And as a follow-up question from that, does AUKUS aim to perpetuate this kind of Anglo-Saxon supremacy on all things defence related?
Well, so I think in terms of looking at the South China Sea and Taiwan, I don't think we're going to see anything too immediate. I don't think that this is going to spiral. I think that this is going to be a slow increase in tension. The Taiwanese government came out, I think it was either earlier today or yesterday, and said that they believe that they are in the most tense situation that they have faced in the last 40 years. So we shouldn't underestimate the severity of what's going on. But I think it's also going to be a kind of a slow build kind of tension. And whilst it's tense now, unfortunately, we still have the opportunity for really quite a lot more tension to be put into the mix before anything starts changing. In terms of how we might see AUKUS as a continued domination of this Anglosphere. If you want to look more at the Anglosphere, I'd say Jack Holland at Leeds has done some brilliant work on that, and really very readable, brilliant book. So I definitely recommend that. But I do think this kind of I mean, the Chinese government accused Biden of having this old Cold War era thinking. I don't think it's quite that, but I do think that this is a representation of the go-to. What is the go-to relationship here in terms of security? And I do think that this relationship with the UK, number one, this security relationship between the US and the UK, we shouldn't forget just how closely intertwined those militaries are. After almost 20 years of working together in the war on terror, over 20 years now of working together in the war on terror, it cannot be understated how closely related those two groups are and how well integrated they are. And that has certain pragmatic and practical implications. If we look at the EU, there are numerous cases that we see coming up where maybe there are exercises, and you hear reports about French vehicles not being able to fit onto German helicopters and vice versa. This kind of lack of ability to work together and to cooperate on a very small scale logistical level, it's important. It's an important factor that actually it shouldn't be underestimated. But I do agree. I've got to say it is a unfortunate reminder that this kind of Anglosphere domination of, or attempted domination of, these kind of security relationships and security alliances, it is still there. It's still up there and it's still coming through. And it's something that we also need to hope that we can move away from. As I mentioned, AUKUS is an empty shell, right? That these contracts in terms of how we move forward aren't yet finished. And there are certain things that necessarily the US must provide because they're the only ones with this technology. However, other bits of this contract, other bits of this manufacturing could be shared. And I think it's unlikely, but I would hope that that will be the direction that we move in, with France maybe given some conciliatory agreements and conciliatory contracts.
Can I just double check something here, if I may, Catherine? Chris, can you just perhaps clarify that for us? The nuclear submarines that the Australians will get, they will be paid by the Australians.
Yes, sorry, they will be paid for by the Australians. However, there are certain elements of the technology, the nuclear powering of the submarine, that the US will need to be servicing. It's highly likely that they will be the ones who do it. 90% certain that they will be the ones who have to provide this kind of servicing. So, I mean, this is one area that Australian opposition towards AUKUS moves in, that this idea that we are now pretty much beholden to the US. We are tied in for a long term because we cannot resupply, we cannot service these submarines alone. We will need to have US cooperation with this for decades to come.
And can I just double check another aspect as the uninformed observer here? The agreement, reminding perhaps the audience that Australia is not a member of NATO.
Exactly.
What happens if, say, for example, the Chinese intercept and destroy one of these submarines? Is there a mutual defense clause built into the agreement that de facto makes Australia come under the protection of NATO, or is it? I mean, how does that work?
So I would say Australian relations with NATO generally and on a military level are very good. So actually that is not something that we would be so surprised to see. But actually, if we were to see this kind of actual kinetic conflict between, sorry, I should say this kind of real world, very visible conflict between China and Australia, let's say, we would not necessarily see NATO drawn into this, but I think it would be something where the US would be involved. I think there are elements of this deal that need to be fleshed out a hell of a lot more, and actually the full mutual defense implications are very interesting, because also, how likely is it that the Chinese will, destroy one of these submarines? Well, is it likely that it's a very visible attack, or could they hack things? Chinese cyber attacks on Australian targets have increased, so that's not necessarily unbelievable. Whereas maybe the bombing or the torpedoing or something like that is a bit less likely, or at least less likely as an initial stage. That might be something that we build to, and I think we will be able to see multiple steps before we get to that stage, and that's when we really see, is the proof in the pudding, and at what point is this mutual defense clause fully committed? I don't know is the answer, but that's what makes this so interesting.
I think I'm going to just jump in here because I've got another question, but we're all definitely on the same line here, because my question is, what role does NATO play in all of this? And one of the questions that we've just got through from Fanny, she says, thank you very much for your presentation, Chris, first of all. And she also wants to know, where does NATO stand in all of this? And especially in light after Afghanistan and the failure in Afghanistan, and does the moment of announcing AUKUS, as well as its institutionalization between the three countries in general, have a meaning in this regard?
Well, I think the US were annoyed with European partners, let's say, in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that actually, if allies had been better equipped and had invested more in their logistical capabilities, they would therefore have been able to assist the US in evacuating, number one, in a more cohesive manner and a more cautious and calm manner, let's say, but would also have been able to take on some of those costs, take on some of those risks. whereas actually that obviously didn't happen, and we can see maybe this is a reminder of, okay, well, if you're not going to step up and you're not going to be the partner that we hope you are, well, we're going to turn to partners who have been there for the long haul. And Boris Johnson did send British Army personnel to help with the evacuation and increased British military presence for that short period, that short extraction window. So you can see this as a kind of reaffirmation of that alliance, but I think it's also signaling this continued lack of this continued anger from the US, maybe not anger, but annoyance, let's say. Annoyance is probably a fairer word, at the lack of military spending in the EU. It's been something that has been commented on by, frankly, every single US president since the creation of NATO. But it is something that US presidents are becoming more and more annoyed at. Trump might have been an outlier in just how rude he was in making that claim. Number two, he also fundamentally misunderstood how NATO works, that you do not pay money towards NATO, you pay money towards your own defense, and that is an agreement in NATO. My paper on Trump's relationship with NATO makes this very clear, that actually Trump fundamentally misunderstood how NATO works. So he's an outlier. But this anger, this annoyance in the US at the lack of security investment in Europe will not go away, and doesn't really look like it's going to be resolved. So this is one reason why I was advocating for a kind of cyber investment, because it is again a middle ground that may be more palatable, let's say, maybe a bit more palatable to EU members, and then also useful to the US. But I think we should see this as a signaled further annoyance, that we should see this as the US still signaling, we are still expecting you to meet this military spending obligation, and we are still incredibly annoyed that you are not doing this. So I'd say, Fanny, this is going to continue to be an issue, and I'd say that this is definitely going to play out more, let's say. I'm excited to see how, well, maybe not excited, but I'm interested to see how it will play out. Excited is probably the wrong word.
Two follow-up questions. One is from an anonymous attendee, but I think maybe building upon what we've already been talking about is, what is Canada's reaction to AUKUS? And the second question from Josh is, could the aims of AUKUS not have been achieved under the existing ANZUS treaty minus the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that the existing ANZUS treaty wasn't used as the basis for this. And also, it's also very interesting to see how this was managed. This was actually, in terms of diplomacy, incredibly poorly managed. Even if you were to do this, this isn't the way to do this. If you're going to pull out of an agreement that you have made 5 years ago with France, which would constitute I think it's 50 or 55 billion dollar investment in French manufacturing, French defense infrastructure. This is going to be a very poor way to do this. You do not wait to inform the French leadership that this is what's going to happen and that you're going to cancel this contract, in essence, until hours beforehand, because this has been worked on for months. I would also say it's interesting to see that the UK was drawn in. I would also say it's maybe not as surprising that Canada stayed out, that Canada retained their kind of more neutral position, with that ability to maintain strong and good relations with a broader array of allies. And I think that that's a crucial part of this, that actually, number one, I would also say Trudeau had enough of his own issues at home to be dealing with, so maybe he wasn't looking to add to his plate. He's got a hell of a lot going on, an election coming up. Does he really want to get involved into a spat with, number one, the French, when he has the Quebec as a interesting dynamic in there? But I think it's also crucial to see the UK's wish to be involved in this. The UK is signalling here that this is their global Britain, this is their we're a significant player. We know what we're doing. We're bringing our clout that is bigger than, frankly, it should be. But we're still maintaining to blag this, frankly. We're still maintaining this ability to continue and to continue being regarded as a more senior player, let's say, than, frankly, our position and our investment in our own military infrastructure wouldn't logically lead one to assume. So I think it's an interesting dynamic. The relations between Canada and AUKUS and how that might unfold will be really very interesting. So, keep your eyes on it. I don't have any more insight, but it's exciting.
Watch that space. The last question I've got through, sorry, Demetrius, I've got one last question, and again, it's from Josh. And he asks, to what extent is New Zealand's prohibition of nuclear weapons in its territorial waters and its participation as a whole a limitation of AUKUS?
Well, I think it creates problems, frankly. I mean, it makes life a little bit harder, but then actually there is quite a lot of good feeling towards New Zealand in terms of its work on climate and its work on leading the way in COVID as well. Developing means for dealing with COVID was well received. So that shouldn't be underplayed, but at the same time, it throws up a speed bump, I'd say. It's a speed bump, it's not a roadblock. It's maybe awkward, not necessarily that, that problematic, but also it does present an option for, New Zealand being a potential partner for EU actors and a potential, collaborative space for further talks as well. Maybe they are the hosts, maybe they are, bringing together, we hope, bringing together AUKUS signatories, the EU, or specific EU members. So I think that could be very interesting. But I don't know how involved New Zealand will be or how significant New Zealand will be in this case, really, because they're kind of, again, with Canada, this kind of approach of trying to remain neutral is going to be a key part of this.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much for collating these questions, Catherine. Thanks, of course, very much to Chris for answering so many questions and giving us so much stuff to think about. I thought it was wonderful. Let me just remind the audience before we break that there is another JMCE seminar in 2 weeks' time. This time we change our focus to Brexit and how environmental groups within the EU dealt with this Brexit conundrum, particularly in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. My colleague from Queen's University Belfast will be joining us for that. So please tune in 2 weeks' time. But in the meantime, Chris, thanks again. All the best.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for participating in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Demetrius, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everyone in the audience, for your amazing questions. Do feel free to tweet me or email me any further questions. But yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.